Well, thank you, Tom, for the introduction. And thank you all for giving US EPA time on your agenda. Tom, and I mean this in the most generous way, really was pestering me to come out here to previous gatherings of this group. And I promised that I would come out here when the EPA actually had something of substance to say about the work we're doing on addressing CO2 emissions from existing power plants. And as I'm sure all of you know and have been discussing for months now, we had a lot to say back in June of last year about what we think the path forward is on addressing CO2 from existing power plants. And what I want to do is follow the example that my colleague Julio Friedman established, which is to talk not too long in terms of an affirmative presentation, but really open the floor for discussion. But let me start with kind of sharing with you the top 10 things that I want you all to know as of this moment. First, I can't express with enough intensity the appreciation that the EPA has for the quantity and quality of effort that went in to the comments that we got back from the public and from state government across the country and from the utility industry as well. Our approach to putting this proposal together was unusual to the extent that before we put pen to paper or input into analytic modeling, we spent a lot of time in meetings like this one, soliciting ideas and soliciting contributions and soliciting advice, guidance, and counsel from stakeholders in the public. And that was a very enriching process for the product we created last June in the form of the proposal. And we've kept at it, not only by means of opening the formal comment record for about a 6-month period ending in December, but by continuing to have discussions like this. And while that may have been hard work for EPA and involved a lot of our resources, we're acutely aware of how much effort on your all's part went into participating in that process. And it's very well reflected in the quality of the comments we got and that are now in the rulemaking record, and exemplified by the quality of the comments that we got from Wyoming. I'm thinking in particular of the PSC, DEQ, and the governor's office. The comments that were submitted, on your behalf really give us what we wanted to and need to know about how to take our proposal from where it was in June into something that's workable in the final in the final that we're planning to issue in the summer. I want to be really clear and assuring that from our perspective, this process is working the way it's supposed to. We put a proposal out that reflected our best thinking as of the time we put it out in terms of what a good approach and a sensible approach to this challenging problem would look like, and also at the same time our best thinking as to how to move the process along so that we fostered another round of information from people who sit in the chairs or the seats in which you sit, and people who have the responsibilities that you all have. And again, based on what the government of the state of Wyoming submitted to us, our expectations have been more than fulfilled in terms of the quality and usefulness of the comments we got. Because at the end of the day, we have only one agenda item here, and that's to come up with a workable program. Not a program that's workable for a computer model, but a program that's workable for all the folks that have to also make the electricity system continue to work while achieving the ultimate or final standards of this program. And that really is an effort that was vastly aided by the comments we've gotten and the discussions we're continuing to have. I guess the last thing I want to say in this vein is we're using a section of the Clean Air Act that makes the states and the federal government co-regulators or partners. And the section of the Clean Air Act, Section 111D, contemplated what, as a matter of practicality, is going to be a long-running, iterative process of a lot of real-time backing and forthing between the EPA, whether it's through headquarters or through our regional offices, and states and utilities and states with each other to really make this program work. So if, for example, Tom Dennis were to decide to pester me to come back after we've put the final out, it would really be hard for me to say no. I perhaps maybe may see the wisdom of calling on an even better representative of the EPA the next time, but I think this is a discussion that is only just beginning. One thing I should note is that we have been blessed with an enormous number of invitations to come to meetings and conferences like this across the country with key people at EPA headquarters in Washington, D.C. and in Research Triangle Park to come out to speak, to participate in meetings, and to be panelists at conferences. We had to do some amount of triage. So we focused on those invitations that would allow us to speak to broad audiences representing multiple states or even national meetings. And we've just not been able to come to individual states for meetings like this one. But it's no accident that one of the few times someone from DC has come to an individual state meeting, it was to come to Cheyenne and talk to Wyoming. Because I think we have a very deep understanding of the pivotal role that Wyoming, as a producer of coal and a producer of electricity generation, plays for this entire region of the country. To borrow a phrase or a concept from the global oil market, Wyoming is the swing producer. And so we have to make this program work for Wyoming if we're going to make it work across the region. And that's something that I, again, want to assure you that we are acutely aware of. I guess the other kind of parameter that is something I want to be clear is that of all the competing considerations that we are weighing as we put together a final rule, and then after we put the final rule put the final rule out, look ahead to the process that states will be engaging in to formulate compliance plans, and then working with us to get those compliance plans reviewed and approved. One thing we know is that while the Clean Air Act gives us a lot of authority, it doesn't give us authority to in any way, shape, or form do anything other than to protect the reliability of the system. So again, I want to convey that that is something that we don't view as an option. We don't view as a jump ball question. It's essential to any kind of success that we hope to have with this program. The last thing I'll say before I open it to questions is that one of the things that those of us who have spent a lot of time on the road across the country have noticed is that out of both necessity and wisdom, the Western area, the Western region, the Western states, and the Western utilities already seem to be well organized to think about the problem-solving task of meeting the requirements of this program and achieving the other critical objectives, which is a reliable and affordable supply of electricity. This part of the country seems to be very well organized to start to think about these problem-solving tasks in a multi-state context, in a regional context that already matches the way electricity is generated, transmitted, and used in this part of the country. And whether it's explicitly through the final rule or through the back and forth we will inevitably have with Wyoming and other states during the compliance plan formulation process, we want to do everything possible to facilitate a regional level problem solving if, as we're hearing, that's something you all want to do. So I think with that, I will open the floor for questions.
Joe, thanks for being here. We appreciate it. A question that I have, when you talk about to accomplish the compliance plan and sort of the back and forthing, what are you hearing from folks on the time that's really required to do a good job at that compared to what time is allowed within your regulatory process to accomplish that?
Well, what I'm waiting to hear from somebody is, hey, EPA, why don't you shorten the time that we have to plan so you can put us out of our misery faster? And I think I'm going to be waiting for a really long time to hear that. What we're seeing in the comments coming in are well-substantiated arguments for providing more time than we proposed for states to put their compliance plans together. Since time is on the table as a result of your question, parallel with that, we're hearing well-substantiated comments supporting arguments that we should provide more time for compliance with the standards. The comments that Wyoming submitted are wonderfully illustrative of the extent to which we're going to have to look at a lot of seemingly discrete issues and how we calculate or recalculate each state's targets and address the kind of constituent elements of the target setting that we proposed. But if there is something that's close to a silver bullet that could possibly dispatch a lot of the challenges that utilities and states have identified, it's that the two-sided, both sides of the time coin. More time to plan and work out strategies and more time to comply.
Great answer, thanks.
Hey, Joe, thanks for coming and sharing all that. We've been hearing also that, perhaps, this Section 111D that as everybody calls this for your program is an intermediary step to the ultimate end goal of less greenhouse gas emissions and a whole variety of sectors, transportation, power generation, industrial applications, CFCs being converted now and so forth, or HCFCs dealing with that. So can you describe, when you're thinking what maybe the end game goals are and the time frame at which we'd ultimately get to, even beyond this current program that we're talking about? So just because of the uncertainty factor that we hear in industry, if, okay, we're going to strive for this current program, but then the rules are going to change by the time we're geared up to make investments. And so if you give people guidance on what's the end game that maybe they should be shooting for.
Well, I think I'm going to probably give you an answer that falls a little short of what you're looking for. There's two things going on. I think that the best shot that the administration gave at answering your question was the June 25th, 2013 Climate Action Plan that the President put out, which is very broad-based. It addresses, CFC substitutes, HFCs. It addresses transportation. It addresses a whole range of the issues you named. But essentially, it met or obeyed a practical constraint, which is how much, given the term that this administration has in office, we think we can address. And beyond that, it's just, I don't think we don't have the legal authority, we don't have the remit, we don't really have the firepower to identify an ultimate outcome. The next clue, I think, that folks will get in answering the question the way you asked it will probably come at the end of this year, when there will be another major round of international negotiations where the U.S. and other countries will purport to obligate themselves to meet an overall emission reduction target. And that was previewed in November in Beijing, China, when the President made an announcement about our goal for 2025. The reality is that that goal encompasses a lot of different discrete actions. And the only thing that EPA can say in answer to your question is that our job is to implement the Clean Air Act and to take the authorities that we have and set standards based on the authorities that we have. And if somebody ultimately decides that the emissions reductions we will have achieved, say as a result of this program, need to be expanded or implemented, then someone's going to have to change or expand our authorities. So I think we're stuck with we may be able to see to a horizon, but I think we're stuck not really being able to see much over the horizon beyond that broader goal that was announced in Beijing.
Other questions from the audience?
Excuse me, David Wendt, Jackson Hole Center for Global Affairs. Mr. Goffman, can you comment on what's been called the Great Discrepancy in terms of our state and other coal-fired power-producing states being debited for the carbon emissions that we generate in-state and send by wire out-state, but in terms of renewable energy, in our case it would be wind power, states like California, which consume that power, get the credit for the emissions reduction. That's something, as you well know, we're really struggling with in this state, and I'm wondering if you could comment on the latest thinking at EPA to resolve that, quote, great discrepancy. Thank you.
Well, that's I would be probably, wasting everybody's time to sort of try to give you a snapshot of what we're thinking about, of what we're thinking, because our thinking is very fluid at this point. A number of states in this part of the country, in fact across the country, including but not limited to Wyoming, gave us some excellent comment on that very problem. It comes up whether you're talking about coal-fired generation or generation avoided through end-use energy efficiency, or, as you pointed out, renewable generation. And the comments we got from Wyoming, the comments we've gotten from other states in this part of the country have been very, very good. They've been very strong. if you go back and look at what we proposed, the underlying premise of our proposal was the expectation that once the final standards were promulgated and the state's obligation to put together a compliance plan was triggered, the states themselves would work perhaps together, or the exporters and importers would work together to kind of rebalance the way flows of generation or generation avoided worked across state lines. But what we did was propose a starting point for how you account for that. And we did that because we felt that there was an obligation that we had to establish and the states had to meet to avoid, say, double counting of renewable energy generation or of energy generation or energy use avoided. As recently as this morning, when we talked with some folks from state government that Tom mentioned, one of the things we started talking about is whether or not we, EPA, should consider not going that far and leaving it more to the states to determine how best to address some of these issues while, say, avoiding the issue of double counting. So I think that, as I said, this is the record that we have as a result of state comments is quite rich. I think the problem you're talking about was very well characterized by commenters, and I think we're just going to have to work through the next couple of months how to come up with a final rule that's as supportive as possible of the states themselves resolving the set of questions you asked.
Other questions? Sorry.
Joe, a two-part question, one on new source review. For those states that enter into projects for purposes of demonstration of advanced coal technologies, do you envision that NSR will be applied, or will there be some leeway if it's part of a compliance program?
I'm sorry, Tom, you didn't get the memo. I'm only answering questions from people who live in Wyoming.
I see.
I'm not kidding, but for you I'll make an exception. And that is an interesting question. We took a stab at generically addressing the NSR issue in the context of compliance that's done by operational upgrades or carbon efficiency upgrades, in effect, at individual sources, in the hope of finding a way to allow states in their compliance plans to manage the NSR issue in a streamlined way as possible without, dare I say, reopening an NSR per se rulemaking. And I think that's what we're going to try to do, and the example you cited is one we would like to take the same approach to.
The other question, for purposes of a state or a region that might be contemplating compliance to deploy renewables, I didn't sense that there was any plenary authority that you have in the statutes that you operate under that allows you or affords you the opportunity to provide some directive comments, let's say, to the Forest Service or to the BLM or to any other agency of the federal government that has a siting responsibility. Have you looked at that? And the last part of that question is, for renewables that are generated in the state but are not consumed in the state, how would they be treated if they were for export?
Well, I think the second question, really overlaps with the question that was asked before about how to reconcile the enlightened the enlightened mechanism of state-by-state planning that the Clean Air Act embeds in 111D with the way it turns out to be in this context of fiction, because that's not the way the overall electricity system operates. That's a central question we're trying to work out. We proposed, between the June proposal and the October notice of data availability, we proposed several different options with respect to how to set each individual state's target based on its renewable capacity, and also how to answer the question you asked, which is, should we put in effect, a priori formula for allocating or balancing imported and exported renewable energy generation? Or, as I mentioned before, is that something that, we have certainly gotten comments suggesting that we might be better off leaving it to the states to address that issue in their compliance plans, provided that they demonstrate that their compliance plans avoid double counting. And so it's a very well defined question, and one that we have a lot of latitude at this point to answer, but I don't know what the answer is going to be.
Other questions? So we've got the man here, so now's your time if you have questions. Well, Mr. Goffman, we do have a question. I'm going to walk through the camera here.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. My name is Claire Breidenich. I'm with the Western Power Trading Forum. I want to return to, I guess, a follow-on to a question from earlier about the fact that we all anticipate that this is the beginning of a number of shots across the bow from EPA as it tries to address greenhouse gas emissions from the economy. And a concern I've had is that the nature of the Clean Air Act and particularly 111D is essentially requiring you to regulate on a sector-by-sector basis. And as companies, as states, as the country looks forward and thinks about long-term global greenhouse gas emissions, it's not immediately clear that a sector-by-sector approach to emissions is going to allow the efficiencies of trading and valuing carbon across the economy. My question is just, is that a concern that you have, that you're aware of? Is there any thinking going on about how to facilitate a longer-term, more flexible approach?
I think that's I agree with your observation. On a very kind of practical level, you've asked a question that, from our perspective, as first and foremost implementers of implementers of the provisions of the Clean Air Act, we just haven't gotten to yet. The volume of CO2 emissions from this sector really dwarfs that of other sectors, and so up until this point, it's made a lot of sense to us to focus on the power plant sector. What comes next is actually, I think, an open question that I really don't think this administration, the current incumbents will have time to reach. And so all I could give you is just, my own personal punditry, which probably wouldn't do anybody any good. That's going to be a set of questions that, at least this administration's successors are going to have to look at. For what it's worth, there are large industrial actors who have certainly started to talk to us about, to the extent that they are emitters of greenhouse gases. Often they're self-generators of electricity, about whether or not we have any guidance to them as to a kind of robust set of ongoing voluntary actions that they can take to sort of stay ahead of the curve. And so my guess would be that if there's a critical mass of, say, large emitting industrial concerns that take that tack, then we may find that the volume of greenhouse gas emissions from that part of the economy is being addressed through other means. That's one potential answer. I actually want to, can I close with two observations? But not to cut off questions, but one is I want to just remind folks, and this was so, the Wyoming State governmental entity comments were such a great illustration of this. Going back to our proposal was based to a significant extent on what we heard between the fall of 2013 and June of 2014 about what states and utilities were already doing that resulted in CO2 emissions, or CO2 emissions being avoided. So in a lot of ways, although I think the initial reaction to the proposal was that it was novel, the underlying substance was based on what we had heard and learned from what was submitted to us during the pre-proposal engagement process, was a set of actions that we believed were very familiar to a lot of folks operating across the country, either in state government or in the utility sector. What we tried to do in that proposal was to take a national level approach to the basic, what we called building blocks, and use a kind of uniform method for applying it to the facts of each state. And one of the things that we learned from the comments that we got is that there were some real significant, at least potentially significant tensions between that national approach and the uniform application of the national approach and what was really going on the ground in individual states. So if there's anything I can preview to the final, it would be that a lot of the effort in moving from proposal to final through the comment record will be to try to reconcile and resolve that tension. The other thing I wanted to observe is that in a lot of ways the Clean Air Act has been very successful in achieving a broad swath of significant pollution reduction over a long period of time in a way that's been largely compatible. In fact, from a macroeconomic view, entirely compatible with economic growth. But one of the things folks observe about the most successful Clean Air Act programs is that there's a really important interaction between what the EPA or the states require in terms of standards and the way in which markets and technology respond to those standards. Some of the most successful pollution reduction programs have achieved that success by having the market itself and technology itself overtake the regulatory requirements and the standards and achieve even greater emissions reductions than might initially have been contemplated. And so as we move from proposal to final, and perhaps even more importantly, after final to working with you all and working with your counterparts across the country on state compliance plans or regional compliance strategies, that's going to be something that we are going to hope to be very aware of and be wanting to really be as supportive as possible with you all on in terms of supporting, integrating the ultimate or the final rule and the final standards with what you all have to do in conducting your businesses and in ultimately producing a continued system of reliable, affordable electricity. So if there are no other questions, I'll close with that.
Any other questions? All right. Well, Mr. Goffman, thank you for coming. We appreciate it very much and look forward to seeing what the final standards are. So,
And we look forward to coming back and hearing in person how you think we did.
you're welcome back anytime.
Thank you.
Let's give him a hand.